Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this afternoon panel discussion on strategies for the transformation of work, degrowth perspective. My name is Melanie Pichler. I work at the Institute of Social-Ecology in Vienna, and I will moderate this panel this afternoon. The question of how to transform work has reached center stage in the degrowth community as well, and this panel will span, one could say, the whole flourishing degrowth repertoire, from work time reduction and work sharing, from universal basic income to universal basic services, from trade union perspectives to the democratic planning and workers' self-management. And most importantly, we're gonna focus on strategies on how to actually achieve these transformations of work. At this panel, we have four excellent speakers. There is, I don't know in what order you could see them, but maybe you could try to wave your hands. So we have Juliet Schor, who is professor of sociology at Boston College in the US. We have Will Stronge, researcher at the University of Brighton and co-director of the independent think tank Autonomy in the UK. We have Anna Daimler, trade unionist and general secretary of the Austrian trade union VIDA, which is the transport and service trade union. And actually, we should have Nikolina Rajkovic, which I think didn't make it to the live session. I'm not sure, at least I cannot see her at the moment, but hopefully she joins us in a bit. She is a labor activist and researcher at the Institute for Political Ecology in Zagreb, Croatia. Before we start with the discussion, some aspects on how we're gonna proceed. So we're gonna have two rounds of inputs on the panel before we move to the audience. And for me, it's still a little bit confusing that there is an audience, but I can't see them. So if you have a question, please write your question in the chat. So you can do so while you can hear the inputs or afterwards. Please also indicate to whom you would like to pose the question, and please be as specific as possible with regard to your question. I try to meet, and now Nikolina may have joined us again. I'm not sure. We will see. I try to meet a gender balance with regard to the questions, although this might not be so easy. But when I'm able to presume the gender of the person that is posing the question, then I try to meet the gender balance. Okay, then I'm not sure about Nikolina, but as, I think, here she comes, but as we start with Juliet anyways, I think we can start with the first round. So the first round will be individual statements of about 7 minutes on how work needs to be transformed for a degrowth society. And we start with Juliet, who has especially focused in her work on working time reduction and the link between work and consumption. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's really exciting to see so many people interested in these ideas in degrowth and sort of fundamental structural transformations of our economies. So I wanted to begin by situating the discussion of work time reduction and degrowth in the current moment, because although we have been talking about work time reduction for a long time, some of us, like myself, for decades, the current moment represents something rather unprecedented, and both creates possibilities and also, many sort of danger points and challenges for people trying to get us on a path of sustainability, well-being, and a reasonably egalitarian societies. So the first point I want to make, just very general, and I'm sure many of you understand this, is that it will be impossible to decarbonize the economies of the wealthy countries in an equitable way without getting onto a path of work time reduction. A mere energy system transformation, which has been the dominant discourse in most countries, is insufficient because it doesn't address the question of energy demand and overall demand for production. And that's really key to sort of whether or not we can achieve the sort of 8 to 10% emissions reductions that the science tells us are necessary at the moment. So to understand why this is the case, we need to think about the productivity, work time, and output or production relationship. So in our economies, productivity is continually being generated. Increased labor productivity is a feature of pretty much all market economies. And these are going on to, more and less higher and lower annual productivity increases, but artificial intelligence and robotization will likely increase that trend over time. We haven't seen as much of that as we probably expected, but which is a much longer discussion, but I think it's fair to say that we're going to see more. And the question is then, what do we do with the higher productivity? And there are two things you can do with it. One is you can produce more output, or you can reduce working hours. And for market economies for the last 150 years, this has been a key question. What do we do with our productivity advance? And for the most part, countries have done both of those things. So we have had a lot of output expansion. We've also had hours reduction since the 1870s. Now, in some cases, those hours reductions have stopped. My own country, the United States, I estimated that beginning in the 1970s, we really went off our path of work time reduction, despite being the country that sort of pioneered work time reduction and sort of was out ahead of the other early industrializers. But if you don't either expand outcome or reduce hours, you get unemployment, and as time goes on, you get more and more of it. So it becomes really a question of which of these two sort of pathways do we take, or what is the mix between output expansion and unemployment and hours reductions. So we really, if you want to have a degrowth or even a stable, steady state economy in which the output is not expanding, you have to go to work time reduction. There's no other place for the productivity to go. It can go into more government, which services, which may have a slightly lower carbon impact, although not that much. Even if you save it, it ends up as demand in the system. So this is our choice. Work time reduction is absolutely, it's a necessary condition for any kind of reasonable degrowth. And really the question is it intentional, or is it in a sort of unintentional, in which case we would call it unemployment. So in the current moment, then, if we understand the necessity for work time reduction, we can ask the question, what's going on now, and how do advocates of work time reduction think about the current moment? So I think it gives us an opportunity to highlight key features of a degrowth vision, especially reduced hours of work. And the first thing is that what we are experiencing now in the sort of shutdown of the economies that we've seen over the last couple of months is that we can transform our economies in ways that really have us sort of double down on basic needs, where we're talking about food, shelter, healthcare, some kind of education. These are pretty much what's happening now. And their role has expanded tremendously. And in a sense, a degrowth society is really emphasizing all of those, plus more free time for people to engage in low cost or non-commodified other kinds of activities. So we can see that the economy can function this way if it needs to. What we can't do is function this way and also retain a commitment to kind of high hours or maximal labor force participation and hours. So it's what's really been key to this also is sort of that pulling back. I think a second really important point is a pragmatic point that as economies come out of lockdown, as we are doing now, it's highly likely that many of the wealthier global north economies are going to be in some kind of recession or depression. There's been a collapse of demand in many sectors due to concerns about the virus and shifts in household behavior. Of course, the service sector especially, travel, leisure, entertainment, apparel consumption is down. It's a big, important industry. And I think that uncertainty and low incomes are also going to keep construction down, both residential and commercial construction. So we're going to be coming out of this period with very weak demand, and we also have the shift out of fossil fuels. So now we also have to think about the usual kinds of responses in a period of low demand. One response, of course, is to try and gin up the economy, put a lot of purchasing power into it, try and get people to consume a lot. That I think will be less effective now. And of course, that's not what we advocate. So the other direction to go to is to think about a much more egalitarian pathway, which is sharing, and that is work sharing. So if we are in a situation in which there's inadequate work for everyone, then we think about how do we share that equally. And of course, in the great collapse of the so-called Great Recession, the financial collapse, 2008, Europe did a lot more of that work sharing than the United States. We mostly had an output collapse, but principles of solidarity, putting them at the core of a response, then also suggest work sharing and also income maintenance. So the last, and I think that sort of income support plus work sharing becomes a lot more viable in a period of low demand, recession, depression than it does in a booming economy. And then the next point is that we need to situate our program within the context of COVID-19 and safety. So what does that mean? In workplaces, factories, offices, service establishments, fewer people should be present at any time. So I think we need to be floating ambitious, innovative ideas that will reduce work time, preserve income, and keep people safe, and to be couching them not just in the language that we have been using for the last couple of decades, a degrowth language or a post-growth language or a sustainability language, that we need to do things for the climate or the environment and also for quality of life. But really importantly now is that we can bring virus and safety and health, public health discourse into our discourse, because the public health discourse leads us in the same direction in many, many ways as all of these other discourses. So I'm not sure if I've come close to how am I doing on time? I'm okay. So I'm going to suggest two ideas. I may not have time to go through them, but we can think more about them in the strategies session. But the first is a really interesting idea that's been proposed, and it's in practice in, I know in Denmark to a certain extent, which is the 4 days on, 10 days off model, in which as we go back to in-person activity, whether it's schools, workplaces, etc., people are there in person for 4 days, and then they go 10 days, 2 weekends and 1 week in which they're not in person. And for many workers, this whose work is in person, this would mean 4 days of work, 10 days of without work. For remote workers, a little bit more complicated, and we can talk that through. I know the Austrian schools are already doing something a little bit like this, the 5 days, 9 days. So this is a strategy that's geared to the amount of time it takes for someone who's contracted the virus to begin to be contagious, show symptoms, and so forth. So it actually provides a high level of transmission reduction, and yet also allows for some amount of in-person. So in workplaces, of course, you would need to supplement it by an income maintenance scheme. I would say for workers under a certain income, you'd want 100% replacement, and then you'd go to 80%, and then for highest earners, something lower. And then for people who are working at home, there'd be some modified version of it, but the point is that their workloads would not stay at 100% if everyone else is going to this lower. So I think the key thing here from the work that I've seen over the years on people's attitudes and experiences of work time reduction is that, and Will may have more to say about this, is that move to a 4-day work week is really important because preferences are very asymmetric. So that once people experience a 4-day work week, there's a lot of reluctance to go back to 5 days. And so getting that established now at a time when we can argue for it on public health grounds is really key, because it begins to lock in a new set of patterns that we can then go forward with and begin to build on. I think to really get to an adequate sort of work time level for the kinds of carbon emission reductions that we need, we're probably going to have to go below 4-day, maybe down to a 3-day, for example. But this is a really important first step.
Thanks.
So I think it's probably time for me. So I'll stop there. There's one other idea I wanted to float, and I'll do that in the strategy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Juliet. We directly move on to Will, who especially focused on the productive links between universal basic income and universal basic services. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and keep this within the bounds of the time I have. Thanks for inviting me. It's really great to be here. It's actually my first Degrowth conference I've ever spoken at, so hope it's not my last. I think just to follow on from what Juliet was saying, I think we have a real opportunity here, probably unprecedented since World War II, to kind of reset the economy according to what we value and what is foundational and essential. So what Juliet talked about very briefly, but I think the current COVID crisis is kind of like a forerunner to the climate crisis to some extent. Now, what do we value? What do we want the economy to be kind of circling around, to revolve around? Probably not financial services, probably not carbon intensive services either. And so I think this discussion around degrowth happening at the same time as COVID can be quite fruitful. And I guess what I want to talk about really, universal basic services, universal basic income, really when I was thinking about this in preparing for the talk, really revolves around decommodification, basically. And I think they complement Juliet's call for a reduction of working time. But particularly insofar as the reduction of working time also asks the question of what do we do with that non-working time? How can we have non-commodified free time, which I think is something Juliet's written about a lot before, and maybe we can touch on in the strategy. But I suppose, universal basic services, the case for UBS really is really an argument for better public services. Now, the question of governance is interesting, whether it's governed by the state or whether it's kind of devolved into kind of smaller governance structures. But I think there's an opportunity here for the degrowth debate, for the climate debate, to think about which services beyond health, education, welfare, which we'll talk about with basic income, but which services could perhaps become basic services, non-commodified, i.e. free at the point of use, free from market logics. Which services can we imagine which actually would help facilitate a more a greener, a non-carbon intensive economy? And I think there's a few things here, but I mean, partly this is also a question about creating green jobs. So green jobs could either be about greening the economy, so you could have a kind of like rewilding service, a kind of tending to community gardens, expanding green spaces, but also you can have non-carbon intensive jobs. So things like care is a non-carbon intensive job. So there's a discussion around green jobs kind of oscillates between these 2 points. And I think it's important to remember that the question of care is essential to the question of degrowth, because across all societies we're aging. We're going to have aging populations. In the UK, it's particularly stark. That's where my research is focused. But how do we have care services which are robust, well paid, free at the point of use, and can kind of effectively become one of the largest, and it is going to become one of the largest employment sectors for our economies, as part of a new basic service or an expanded set of basic services? And we can talk about green infrastructures, things such as I said, share leisure facilities. I think there's an interesting question around what kind of infrastructure we need to make sure we don't have the work-consume cycle that Juliet's written about so well. How, currently, if you go to town centres, I know in the UK, although everyone else can speak from their experience, town centres and city centres are built very much around the work-consume cycle. If you're not working, you're going out to shop. Now, how do we shift that dynamic so that we have much more greener, kind of less carbon intensive infrastructure, whether you want to call it leisure infrastructure or whether you don't think that's helpful? That's an important question to ask. And I think I'll shift to basic income here, because I think the two should be intertwined. I think a less consumptive society needs to have one where you have economic security. We can't just we don't like an austere service-based economy. You have this kind of dystopian image of lots of people who are impoverished riding around on free buses. I think a minimum income, whether it's a guaranteed income, whether it's a kind of negative income tax, or preferably a basic income, something that's really important to the degrowth debate, mainly for 2 reasons. One, it's about giving workers a choice. I don't believe that people who work in carbon intensive industries like the job because it's a carbon intensive industry. They like the job because they have friends there, there's a social life, it has economic security, it's given them a career. If we can start introducing a minimum income guarantee, not only does it bolster a society with more free time in terms of having economic security without having to work for it, but also give workers the economic choice that they might see better options elsewhere. They might have a bit of a kind of space between themselves and the job they're tied to for their career. I think it's important to give them that economic freedom. And then second of all, economic unrest, basically. I think if COVID's the first of a series of crises, whether it's a pandemic or a technological crisis, in terms of kind of technological unemployment, or whether it's the climate crisis, we don't want people to be left behind. And we want the more universal the policy, as we all know, the more egalitarian it is. Whether it's universal services or universal income, we need to prepare our society our economies for a more resilient, to be more resilient, to prepare them for the current crisis. And I think a guaranteed income is almost, to use the American term, a no-brainer, as it were. And I think there's no accident why governments like Spain or other governments are either implementing some form of minimum income guarantee. It's still targeted, but it's no accident they're doing that, because they recognize that actually this current crisis, the COVID crisis, is a real crisis of the real economy, right? It's not like the financial crash where there's a whole range of mortgage, debt, buybacks, things like this. This is a crisis for people who work in all sorts of arts or person-to-person industries. And how do you, if you simply have to give them the economic security, what's the easiest way? It's probably not through a really convoluted welfare system. It's just by putting cash in bank accounts. And so I think if the COVID crisis is the lead up, the run up to the environmental crisis, which is coming down the line, we need to start dislocating income from work. That can help us transition across industries, if we need to, from carbon intensive ones to green ones, but also can help, as Juliet referred to, can complement work income reduction So allow people to afford to reduce their working week, even if if their employer doesn't want to pay them 100% of their old wage. So I think those two things they're more arguments for how to create more resilient economies, but I think we're going to need that when we enter the next phase of let's say economic reform in light of the climate crisis. And I'm going to finish here, but I do agree with Juliet that I think this is fortuitous that this conference was happening now, even though it's going to happen anyway, because the COVID crisis really has shown us that we need to start thinking about more egalitarian policies which secure our working and non-working lives, so that we can face that crisis itself. But I think the discussion of strategy is particularly important, but I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Will, also for keeping the time. And we move on to Anna, who's gonna give you a critical trade union perspective on the degrowth perspective of work. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello to the audience. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, trade unions and degrowth is a bit complicated, I would say. And let me explain you why. The question was the transformation of work. And for the transformation of work, our opinion is that workers are important to include, to ask, and to take into consideration that there is a struggling on a company level, on a workplace level, that is not really included, or to a very small extent included into all the theoretical work that is done on a scientific basis. So what we face talking about degrowth or climate change is that for trade unions, we are voluntary organizations. So our members are free to come to us, and they have a main expectation on trade unions. One basic expectation is to save their jobs. So there were in former times broad transformations of society, basically due to technical development. And we figured that out, I would say. So I agree on that point with Juliet. Most of that was taken either by rules or by technical inventions that were seen very critical at the beginning, usually. So the point that for us is important, we are usually working on a company level with the people that have fear, often. Rather, if the discussion is the reduction of working hours, or even if it's the discussion on basic income. So we have to take into consideration that there is a lot of skepticism for that transformation. And for trade unions, there are some answers that are not given yet. And I hope that we're going to work on that together within the next months. Collective bargaining, at least in Austria, basically means that there is a rise of productivity that is shared, kind of. So the whole story is about making the cake bigger so that the share of the cake that is going to be transferred to the workers is getting bigger as well, right? So that's the basic thing about collective bargaining. So if we are talking about making the cake smaller, or even arguing that the cake is not necessary to grow at all, then we're in trouble with the collective bargaining systems on a very, very basic level. And even if we're talking about reduction of working hours, it's usually a choice between receiving money or receiving less working hours. So even for reduction on working hours, the cake needs to grow, to keep it simple. And that's something that is not solved, or probably we did not understand it, that yeah, we probably are not the experts in degrowth theory, but that's a question we think has to be answered, and we don't have an answer at the moment. Productivity is the basic indicator, or the rise of productivity at least, to divide the cake, and the growing of the cake is something good then. So I would be curious to talk on that point a bit today as well. And then, as far as I understood so far, there is a kind of a critical point of technological improvement, or degrowth is often critical towards technological improvement. That's not the case for trade unions usually, because there are technological improvements that definitely are not good, but there are a lot that are good and have been good. So take the railways, right? Now they are mostly fully electrified, which is good, and which is good for the environment. It would not be the case if there would have been no technological improvements. So there are questions that we think we need answers for that on a basic working place level, and we face it. I mean, the trade union WIDA is also responsible for the transport sector. We know the transport sector and the rise in the transport sector is a problem out of an ecological point of view. And there's a point where we meet, I think, because what we see is that rise of transport is first done at the wrong transport mode. So road transport is really rising very high, and it is also the sector where working conditions are decreasing. So as far as we experience, there's a high correlation between the rise of environmental problematic things and the decrease of working situations, or working rights, or labor rights and income situations. It's the same for the air traffic, by the way, as far as airlines are concerned. So there, I think, is a kind of a conjoint. Thank you. there we have to think how we can put those two topics together, and we believe that one important thing is that how the markets are functioning is dysfunctioning out of an environmental point of view, and also out of a human rights and workers' point of view. And that's it for the first statement. I'd like to focus on the strategies, actually, because I think we have a lot of in common and should focus on that to make it happen, not just to talk about it.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we will proceed with Nicolina, who is here. That's very good. Managed to join the meeting again. Nicolina focuses mainly on democratic planning of public sector and workers' management. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation. I would say that in the debate of transformation of the work in the post-carbon transition has to take into account the present global crisis, health crisis, the way how it unfolds globally, and its consequences, as well as the lessons of the history of labor struggles that came as a response to similar global crises in the last century. I believe that in the pandemics, the imagined scenarios about the degrowth societies have partially played out, and which is wonderful on the one hand, but it's also scary at the same time. So on the one hand, we had an opportunity to see how in incredible speed our lives can be transformed with living and consuming less. So the scenes of the cities experiencing clean air for the first time after many years due to the reduction in air and road traffic, or over touristified places without tourists, where the local kids playing football, such as the case in the deserted center of Dubrovnik, Croatia, which is a scene that hasn't been present for decades, or wildlife and ecosystems recovering and so on. And apart from that, we could see that the states have the capacity, so they're not weak, they have the capacity to efficiently respond to the crisis and convert private or tourism sector from the logic of profit into accommodating basic human needs, like is the case with Spain nationalizing private healthcare sector and transforming the hotels into hospitals, or France using long-distance passenger trains as mobile hospitals, and so on. And likewise, we've seen a rise in solidarity support groups on local levels, so people engaging in care work and worker organizing at the shop floors, or using social media to organize and demand for healthier and better working conditions. And apart from these scenarios, which provide kind of moral comfort, especially if you are part of the middle-class worker who enjoyed privilege of working from home, that is preferably not rented, who is possibly not a parent and has opportunity to keep the same paycheck at health security. So we've seen a difference between them and those who risk their health and wages if they didn't go to work. And COVID-19 revealed just inequalities that we've already know they exist. So the burden of pandemics was unequally distributed across the space, class, race, and gender, and this is the lesson we need to take into account. And those who lost and risked their lives every day were the workers that were previously considered parasites in public sector, public transport, education, postal sector, or in food processing and distributing industry, as well as maintenance sector and gig economy. And these workers have now become known as essential, with a clear difference, as many of the authors noticed, that now them being essential refers to society and not employers. And yeah, so these workers certainly didn't have a possibility to romanticize quarantine-induced life. On the contrary, for the seasonal agricultural workers in Romania and Bulgaria, and just to name some of them, the choice to make was between being unemployed or to perform low-wage or underpaid work. In other cases where we can see how the political economy of pandemic works, were parents with small children or kids in school who had to perform the role of not only parents but preschool or school teachers. And beside the class dimension, we also have gender perspective of COVID. The Eurofound research named Living, Working and COVID-19. The preliminary data on the EU level regarding household division of labor during pandemics show that more than 1/5 of the responders claim that they are experiencing difficulties in coordinating parental and their usual working duties, and more than half of them are women. And furthermore, what the preliminary results of Eurofound research show is quite gloomy picture in terms of political representation and the economy. And people across the EU are reporting dramatically low level of trust in the EU and their national governments. Particularly in traditionally pro-EU member states, such as France, Italy, and Spain, raising fundamental questions about EU action during the crisis. And more than 1/4 of respondents across the EU at this stage reported losing their job in the temporary or permanently, with young men mostly affected. Half of those in work are also seeing their working hours reduced, especially in Romania, Italy, France, Cyprus, and Greece, but not in the Nordic countries. So obviously what this research shows is that states and the Euro and the EU largely fail and bring policies that really aim to accommodate human needs in crises that will go beyond the short-term perspective. Do I have some time more? Okay. So just to start with the strategies, I'd say that the obvious strategies to transform the way we live and work are to be found in more democratic planning of the production and fighting mass employment, which will be on the agenda in the following years. And this is precondition for middle and long-term strategies for building more utopian, or let's call it post-wage work society. So what we need now, and I think that now it's important, what we need is an extension of rights, which are political and workers' rights. And as many of the panelists already said, One of the most important response is a collective response in building strategies for decommodification of labor, which means that we have to extend our rights to have equal access to public services. And this is the right that is linked to being a member of society and not having to do something with an income. Furthermore, apart from equal access, we need a high quality of public services. So we need to extend the right of workers and users to participate in planning and decision-making process. Why I'm mentioning putting such importance on the public sector is because I think that workers still have some right to unionize there and capacity to organize big campaigns. And because that's also reproductive sector essential for society. Will has mentioned already introduction of universal basic income, which is important as a part of reforming public policies. Also the state. So we need progressive taxation and withdrawing subsidies to fossil fuel industry. As Australian case showed us, that a government provides $30 billion in subsidies per year to the coal, oil and gas industry, which is far more than Australian government has spent to support Australians affected by the coronavirus or the catastrophic wildfires earlier this year. So the fact that we worked and consumed less led to lower emissions, but these are not strategies for decarbonization of society, as many of the activists and researchers from the left warned. We need large investment in public infrastructure that will prepare cities for the forthcoming ecological crisis, which is obviously a well-balanced Green New Deal. And the question is to what extent we accept this large transformation of fossil fuel industry that will require huge amounts of material and human resources that should be carried out under political concept of just transition. And finally, I think the transformation of ownership is crucial for sustainable workplaces and building of solidarity economy, where workers' management models will have a prominent role, so meaning being able to be owners and producers at the same time. The occupation of workplace appears to be a survival strategy in the economic recession, and it has been present throughout various models around the globe. The labor autonomy and sovereignty should be on the agenda not only as a practical tool to fight forthcoming layoffs and unemployment, but this should be also a political principle of the environmental and social movements, and for building workers' alternatives such as co-ops of self-management models. We need to have solidarity networks, not only on community level, but also on the state level with the public policies, and which we can discuss maybe later on within the strategic part.
Thank you very much, Nikolina. So we're gonna have a second round now, and as there are a lot of questions, and I just want to tell the audience that it's really good that you have a lot of questions, and they're really good questions, but at the same time I will definitely not be able to take up all of them, but I will give every one of you now in the second round. I try to also hand over some of the questions to you so that we will at least have the possibility to answer some of them. So we're gonna move on with Juliet and the second round on, so how will we actually, so what are the strategies to reach a working time reduction, and what you mentioned, work sharing, because as you said, you've been researching this for decades now, so it's not that there are no proposals, but that the problem is obviously that it's difficult to implement them. So what do you think also from, and you already started to discuss it, what is it that we need now And I would like to give you also one of the questions that was raised, and I think this is important, especially also for working time reduction, because this works especially for the formal sectors and for countries in the global north. What would it mean for more informal sectors and for peripheral and semi-peripheral countries, like it was?
Okay, thank you. So there's one other, I will answer that question, but there's just one other thread that has gone through a lot of the responses and comments and questions that I want to talk about, and it relates especially to Anna's contribution, and that is around productivity. There's of course one strain in the degrowth movement that says we should be aiming to not to grow productivity, that it just causes more unemployment and it's a bad thing. And so, it's another one of the things that we're against. And I want to speak really strongly against this perspective, because if the degrowth movement is arguing for less output, done in more labor intensive, less intelligent, kind of less efficient or smart ways, it's really going to have a very hard time offering people something that feels better than what they have. We've got to have a positive vision of a society in which people are better off. And we may wish that people didn't care about what they consume, and that people could be happy with much lower levels of material prosperity, or not material in terms of throughput, but sort of value in value terms. I just think that's not feasible. And Anna's contribution really targeted this, which is that people want improvements, people want quote unquote progress. And I think that this is what productivity allows us to do, which is that it allows people to have any given amount of production with less work. And so that's a real benefit. And then we've got to work on the material consequences of that, both the material throughput and also and in particular the fossil fuels, and really radically dematerialize and decarbonize that. But to say that we're also against working in ways that allow us to get our work done more quickly or use artificial intelligence and so forth, I think I just don't think it makes any sense. So I think that's really key, is that we want a high productivity pathway that frees up a lot of resources, human and material. And I mean, especially under those conditions, I think that's where the inequality piece of it comes, because if productivity growth is used in inegalitarian ways, yes, it becomes a real problem. But if we have the kind of vision that all three panelists have been talking about, Nicolina most especially, where we're putting those equity concerns at the center of the vision, productivity actually becomes, I think, a positive tool. So let me say one thing about the global South, and then I'll get back to the strategic and what my second point, what my sort of second policy direction was going to be. I don't think work time reduction is really a viable strategy for the global South. In the global South, you have large numbers of people who are grossly underemployed, many of them in the informal sector. And so what you need to do there is a big energy transformation and a much more egalitarian economies than you have, focusing more on, you've got to focus on economic security, you've got to focus on ecological restoration, you've got to focus on climate resilience and so forth, really preparedness for the apocalypse that is, has already begun. Wealthy countries need to be pouring money into climate mitigation and resilience in these countries. But work time reduction makes a lot more sense for the countries that are rich already and have long hours of work, not very large numbers of people who are unemployed. So, I mean, I've always advocated for it as a global north strategy. So we were asked to sort of talk about who the main actors are and the kind of strategic visions. So I've said one thing, which is that I think productivity growth is a key part of a strategic vision. I also think that a public health frame and sort of having strategic actors as the public health professions at the current moment is really important, but also going forward, because degrowth is also a public health strategy. I mean, one of the things about contemporary global capitalism with its long hours of work is that it's making people very sick, both because of their long working hours and the impacts on their own health and well-being and those of their families, but also because of the high levels of carbon and other kinds of pollutions associated with high output societies. So public health is a key issue here. I mean, one of the things I've worked on a lot over the last, 3 decades is the association between long working hours and carbon pollution. And it's a pretty strong one. And one of the things we find is that when you have shorter annual hours of work, you have less carbon pollution. And I've looked at this relationship across time, across countries, across states in the United States as well. So public health, I think, is key. Trade unions are also key. And that's where, again, sort of coming to a solution to the dilemma that Anna raised is really important. So how do we have a movement that actually makes workers better off at the same time that it gets us out of the growth, off the growth pathway and onto a safe decarbonizing pathway? Obviously, progressive political parties. We've talked about, Nicolina talked about gender, so I think feminism, feminist organizations and women's organizations are another important ally in this on account of the unequal burdens of work and the ways in which shorter hours of work can be part of a feminist gender egalitarian strategy. So I'm probably close to my time, so let me just mention the second thing that I wanted to talk about, and very practical. In addition to that 4 days on, 10 days off, and some people had some questions about that, lots to say about that, like anything, it is complicated. But the other thing I want to mention is a renewed push on early retirement and moving people out of the labor force. So work time reduction is important both at the level of what is the schedule of work of people who are in work, but also what fraction of the population is working. This is a really important time to keep older people out of face-to-face work, and that policies that allow early retirement will also help to reduce the total amount of work being done in the society. Yes, you have to have income maintenance to a certain extent, but and it's complicated with the carbon emissions. If you give people as much income as they had while they were in work, it probably won't have much of an impact on carbon emissions. But pensions typically don't replace 100% of income. So especially if you protect income for lower paid workers so that they do have enough to have decent standards of living. This is another avenue. And I know in some European countries, it's a lot more difficult now because of pension pressures as well as labor supply issues. But to the extent that we can think creatively and out of sort of narrow pensions have to be funded in this way. I mean, we've seen, as Nicolina made the point, our government's turned very rapidly to income replacing activity in this moment. We can also think more creatively about retirement, and instead of this push to get more and more people into work, think about how we can pull people out of the labor force in ways that will meet their needs. Thanks.
Thank you, Juliet. We will go on with Will on how do we actually go there? How do we achieve UBI and UBS? And I would add maybe two connected questions from the chat. The one is on what are actually examples for universal basic income and universal basic services where they were actually implemented or where they are now discussed in the course of the COVID-19 crisis. And the second one is there actually evidence that people would switch to more caring, greener jobs if they have the possibility to do so?
Thanks. Yeah, okay, so I guess I wasn't entirely clear about UBS as well. I mean, the UBS, Universal Basic Services, kind of springs from this report that UCL published. 7 services which should be decommodified, should be free at the point of use. That's housing, the internet, broadband, which I think is quite an interesting one for COVID, transport, healthcare, education up until university level, etc., etc., etc. But there's 7. You can go see it online, UBS report. But I think that what I said at the start is really that these services are really just kind of like the welfare state 2.0, basically. And I think the COVID crisis has shown that. So to some extent, some of these services exist all over the place, right? In the UK, we have free healthcare. In parts of Europe, other parts of Europe, they have free education up until university level. In the UK, we don't have that. Obviously, free food support is available, but it's kind of in a really, it's kind of a stigmatized food banky kind of way. And free transport is, for example, in Slovenia, in the city of Vienna, there's free transport. So you have these kind of free services that are dotted around in all sorts of places in Europe and beyond. And the idea behind UBS is basically to say that it's not that expensive to provide these services free at the point of use. And actually it will create a more binding social contract. It will help the poorest in society most. And I think in terms of economic shocks or economic crises, having free services at the point of use is really, really important. And so examples are all over, as I said. And basic income, if you haven't looked it up already, there's plenty of examples around the world, not necessarily just in COVID, but before that, whether it's the Alaska Permanent Fund, a kind of UBI, whether the Income Experiment in Canada in the 70s, that's a form of income guarantee. Spain right now are introducing a minimum income guarantee, but it's targeted at certain families. It's not quite an unconditional basic income. There have been experiments, they're starting an experiment in Scotland for basic income. So I mean, it's an idea which is tested so much. It's almost as if, everyone keeps saying test it, just because they're reticent to actually implement it. So you have a kind of, in the UK, we have a welfare system where they trialed a new system called universal credit, and it's awful, very stigmatizing, very disciplinary. It punishes people for not looking for work properly, etc., etc. But they're still trying it. Its rollout's been very undeveloped. Sorry, it's really uneven development of its rollout. So they're testing that, but they won't test basic income. So it tells you something about the kind of government policies that we're dealing with here. But so there are examples of form of basic income all over the place, and basic services are just are kind of the same, like an upgrade of our current services all over Europe, basically. Now that's that. I hope that answers the questions a little bit. The question on strategy. And this speaks to the working time reduction as well, which the organisation I work for, Autonomy, we've done a lot of work on, partly inspired by Juliet's work, actually. We think the public sector is a really important, this is what Nicolina was saying, the public sector is really, really important for all change, basically. I think the public sector as an employer can set the standard of what good work is. So good work means reduced hours, it means decent pay, but also the kind of work you're doing. So I'd advocate job creation programs. Even though I agree with the reduction of work we need to have in society, I think we need to have job creation programs which set standards for what good work means, what a good job is. And then the public sector can then encourage and basically put pressure on the private sector for similar jobs, basically. If you have a good public sector job, which is similar to a private sector one, but it pays well and the hours, it's a 4-day week, historically, the public sector has often been the vanguard of some of these innovations. So I think the public sector is really important for this transition. And then I think, just quite bluntly, I think trade unions have to be front and center. And I guess I'd encourage anyone here listening to basically join a trade union, but it's not simply enough to join one, but become active in it. Become active in a trade union, and also try and affect trade unions' aims and goals. Because actually, rank and file trade unionists really are often very, very aware of and supportive of a lot of these demands and policies. I think it's important to start. You know, in the UK, we've had a kind of weakened trade union movement for about 30 years. It's become weaker and weaker, but now for the third year running, membership's increasing. And it's important that lots of particularly young trade unions get involved and start shifting the direction of some of the, particularly the larger unions, and fighting for these things. You know, working time reduction was won by unions. You know, that's a really important point. But equally, standards of good work should be led by them as well. So it's a very boring point, but I think it's really important. Trade unions should be at the front and center. And then I think, just to add to that briefly, I think basic income can be a really helpful tool for trade unions. I think there are examples in the UK's history, but I'm sure around the whole of Europe as well, of strike funds being built. And I think having an income outside of work will help battles inside of work, help negotiations, help bargaining. Because the whole point of unemployment and the kind of really stigmatized unemployment systems that we have, particularly in the UK, is pretty bad. I'm sure you're all very aware of how bad the UK's social security system is. They've always played a political function, which is discipline workers to make sure they stay in their jobs, don't cause a fuss, because unemployed life's worse than employed life. So if you can start building life outside of employment, whether that's through reducing working time and giving people more leisure, giving them a taste of what it's like to have more life outside of work, or to give them economic security outside of work, I think that will help struggles in the workplace as well. So I think strategically, basic income is important. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Will. So Anna, everyone says trade unions are important, but at the same time, I have the feeling that there are also quite different strategies of trade unions. Will mentioned rank and file trade unions, which I wouldn't say that these are this is the major trade union strategy in Austria. So what do you think? What might be strategic ways forward? I linked this to one question that was posted in the chat, which said, what about cutting up the cake differently so that workers get a bigger share?
Yeah, thank you. Well, if we want to change the world, I guess it's not so much a discussion of content or different concepts. I think we're more or less here on the same side, but it's a question of power. And as far as power is concerned, I would say there are different levels of power, and we have to talk how we regain power back on that middle and left-wing side of the society, because what we are seeing now is that ideas from the right, again in COVID, are trying to gain power, although all the problems that were discussed before are rising and have been there before COVID-19. So if we are talking about power, I think we should focus as a kind of a middle or left-wing movement on how we regain power. Regain power on a company level, regain power at universities, at schools, at all that educating points, kindergarten, so on, and regain power in politics, in decision making. And as far as I mean, I'm an activist since many years and working in a trade union for more than 12 years. We are always very good in making content, producing content, papers, and thinking of content, discussing, fighting about words. But that's not the point, actually. The point is, how do we make people to involve, to engage, to be angry and try to get back the power that was taken. And for us, as we learned, I mean, we are part of that. We are part of the problem and part of the solution, I think. We learned a lot during the last 2 years that it starts with the words that we are using. It starts how we try to get the content on the economy level, because we are a lot talking in a very sophisticated language, on a very, how should I put it? We're not talking in emotions, but usually all the learning theories are telling us, and we know it, that we are not functioning on kind of a logical thinking way, but we are emotional human beings, and we're not addressing this emotional and learning theory part of humans, or at least we're not very good at it. All of us, I think, so far, all the discussions that are taking place in the left-wing movements. So I think that is one important step that we have to do ourselves. And then we have to much more work together on the strategies and not so much on the content. So unite to regain power. That's very, very important. For trade unions, for sure, it's a challenge to reactivate participation in the company level, at least in Austria, because we have a very good system, but it's very representative. So there are work councils that are very fast in the middle between management and the workers. And what we are trying now at the moment in some pilot projects is not to have them in between, but to realize that we have to improve the methods of participation in order that they are really just speakers. So representing again, not being intermediates between management and workers. I think that's important, but it's, I mean, you need a lot of small steps, not the big clash, right? So a lot of small pilot projects where we focus on that transformation at the working places itself. And that has a lot to do with being brave often, because it's a fight, and fighting is not easy on a company level, because you're always afraid of losing your job. That's what we focus at the moment, for example, in the Laudamotion and Ryanair conflict. So the workers are fighting for their jobs, and they are willing to accept a salary that is below the poverty line just in order to keep their jobs. Even if now we are trying to organize participation, they are skeptical, and I understand it, because they know the labor market is in despair. They know some of them have earnings that are way below everybody else, so 8,000 euros for a pilot. That is a lot, but he made his living with that, so he kind of, yeah, the kids are in a more expensive school. He probably has a house where he has to pay a credit for, and so on and so on. So those are really basic problems that we have to face in that transition process. What can be a good offer for persons to go through that transformation and change their jobs? And we have to be honest, at the moment, if the companies are not willing to cooperate, which is definitely not the case if we're talking about Ryanair, then all that mechanism that we know in Austria and that we used at least when we entered the European Union, we had, how is the English word? The company and the state put together money in order to make the transformation happen. So to
public-private partnership.
No, it's not a public-private partnership. It's kind of a trust, a workers' trust that is paid in by the company and by the state in order to organize the transformation. So to pay for the payment gap, and also to re-educate the people. And I think so one part is to remember, remember things that worked in the past. It's not the first transformation that we're going through. But an important point is, how can we reestablish to be brave and to fight? Because it's a fight. It's a fight for a world where we don't have any bloods on our hands, concerning nature, concerning humans, and concerning animals.
Thank you very much, Anna. We move on to Nicolina, and as you mentioned, Nicolina, that democratic planning would be key. I think it would be interesting for you to elaborate a little bit more on how do we get there if we, in practice, actually see the opposite at the moment of what democratic planning would look like.
Okay, but first, in order to answer that, first, I would like to reflect a bit on the strategies for reaching reduction of the working time or working week. I think it's very important, and now it's it's not easy to be smart after everybody basically said everything. But I think that what Will mentioned, so that reduction of working time was actually brought as a result of the struggle in the post-Second World War, as a struggle of the strong and organized working class. So 40 hours work week is a result of organized labor. But before that, we had 100 years of organizing that labor and political representatives that were supporting it. So I think that now we are in a situation where we have to be, we have to have some reservation towards it. As Juliet said, it's a question to which extent working reduction is a viable strategy for the global South. As we know, we already have actually a configuration of the labor market works in a way that we have substantial portion of the global workforce working either excessively long hours, so more than 48 hours per week, which particularly affects men, or short hours, which is a part-time work, which predominantly impacts women. And this is also distributed differently across the globe. So I think that strengthening labor is the first step to come to the possibility to think about reduction of the working week. In which cases it can. I think it's very beneficial, and it has been also proposal coming from the worker cooperative movement or a movement of recooperated factories, where the working reduction of the working days after the occupation of the factory, which is not a piece of cake, but as let's say that workers have already occupied the factory and now they're planning their production. First obstacles that they encounter is probably large difference between qualified workers, which will probably leave the factory because they will try to find employment somewhere else. And what we have usually in such cases, in such practices, are that the process of becoming self-managed worker is very long, and it is very ambivalent, and it takes a lot of courage, as Anna said, because there are certain skills to manage the workplace, such as accounting, marketing, communication, and so on. So after recuperating of workplaces, workers actually have little time to devote to acquire such skills and knowledge. due to the heavy and exhaustive working days, because they have to take care of the fact that they need to raise the productivity. So solution of this problem could be, as Michael Lebowitz also said, in reduction of traditional working day, which would allow the workers to attain the skills which are necessary for running production. And regarding democratic planning, I would also say that well, in the workers' cooperatives and management models, if they exist, and there are some examples in the world, mainly in Latin America and Mediterranean countries, some in the Balkan states. This is a huge problem, even when the workers do run their factories. And first of all is that, as I said, transmission of knowledge and skills is very hard to attain in the process, and there are many obstacles. First, coming from very poor legal frameworks for cooperatives and workers' co-ops models. Then there are no stable finances and possibilities for constructing different business models. So in that case, we need restructuring banking sector to provide sustainable finances. Also, we need to have certain inner mechanisms within the workplaces that will allow workers, because it's not only enough to be to have the shares and to be the owner, but it's also important to sustain a level of democratic decision making, which is not usually the case. So yeah, in order to have democratic planning, whether it is in public sector or in the workplaces, I think we have to go back to think about the organizing labor and strategies for that. And I think, labor movement has its difficulties, especially because the level of the unionization rate is very low. And there's also a question how to organize gig workers and precarious workers. But I think that we can learn also from the social movements as well. But, protests are not, protests can be momentum, but we need to have courage to, and devotion to organize in a long-term way.
Thank you very much, Nikolina. Time is running fast, but we do one more round with questions from the audience, and it's quite nice that some of you have already. I saw that, Juliet, you've already commented in the chat. That's perfect. So there is a very lively discussion, orally and written. And we proceed with Will. So maybe to make you a little bit confused with who's gonna be next. Will, in your final statement, I would like to, because you mentioned in your previous statement that there are a lot of experiments with universal basic income, but at the same time, it's not really rolled out or scaled up systematically. So what are the barriers to these? And connected to this is the more broad question maybe. So how is change to be achieved if governments, also in the current situation, are still on a growth track?
Wow, so the second question is pretty big. But the first question, I mean, there's a huge, I don't know, I haven't been paying attention to polls in other countries, obviously, because everything's so intense and history is sped up at such a pace now that you can basically only stay in your own silo. But polls in the UK, there's huge support for system change. And I know that's ambiguous because it could mean a number of things, but nonetheless, what was surprising for me was that there's huge public support that people don't want to go back to what happened pre-COVID. And that basically means austerity. In the UK, we had one of the worst austerity regimes in the world, really. And there's a huge appetite for systems change. The welfare system has proven entirely inadequate. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but effectively it's so many hoops you have to jump through, so bureaucratic. The system was crashing. It makes no sense in these times, but also we can think about the climate crisis. Does it make any sense to ask people, are you looking for a job? And if you aren't, then you can't get income support. That just sounds ridiculous now. So I think how to make that change is partly public pressure, i.e. like this important wave of support for huge systems change, and also even the polling on things like minimum income guarantees or basic income. I've seen them kind of rocket up, whereas prior to this, and it's about how many people are using the service. When there's a small amount of the population using social security, it's very easy for social security to be stigmatized by the press, for politicians to talk about scroungers and parasites. But when in situations like this, everyone realizes that actually at some point, many of us will have to use social security systems, suddenly, it's obviously not good enough to give someone below the poverty line income support, because it's just simply it's more or less inhumane. And so I think in times like this, in times of crisis, it's important to push for that more universal change. And that's how the welfare state was born in the first place. After World War II, huge crisis to our economy, soldiers coming back from war, it was obviously not going to be good enough to give them, to let them just be unemployed, even though many were. We needed a new social security net. So part of it is public pressure. I also think there's a role for trade unions to play. I think before the welfare state in the UK, trade unions would be giving income support to workers out of work in industries. And I'm sure in other parts of Europe that might be the case. But I know in the UK, for example, they used to provide that security system. Sorry, 1 minute left. And I think I don't think they should be doing that now, but I think there's a way for trade unions to be active and be engaged and be campaigning around how out of work support should be administered and at what level. Particularly, as has been mentioned, we have fairly low participation rates in trade unions, but as a way of getting engaged in people's lives and people's communities, getting involved in that conversation is a good way to campaign. But to some extent, I'm hopeful about change because of the huge disruption this has had and what's revealed to us about our economy. Anyway, I'll stop there. Sorry, I didn't mention anything about how to get states who are on a track for productivity, but I'll leave that to others to also think about.
There is a virtual coffee break afterwards, so everything that is not solved now can be solved in the coffee break afterwards. And there was one comment. If you could share the UBS report that you mentioned in the chat, that would be nice. Okay. And we. Juliet, I would like to pose you one question that came up quite early in the chat, and I think it's for the degrowth community an important one, because you talked a lot about productivity gains and about productivity gains being a good thing, and then it's not good to focus on less productivity. The thing, especially in ecological economics, is also that if we want a phase out of fossil fuels, they're gonna be less productivity, not because we want less productivity, but because it's not only labor that adds to productivity, but also fossil energy. So maybe you could reflect a little bit on this in your closing statement as well. Thank you.
Well, it's a great point, and it's I think that in a way it makes the point about other kinds of productivity being good even stronger, which is that there are questions about sort of technological advances that could really dramatically increase the productivity of renewables. And not just, as in the current moment where we're still using a fair amount of fossil fuels to create renewable energy sources, but, really big forward motion, which we absolutely are going to have. But a key thing is agriculture, where a shift out of fossil fuel-based agriculture is going to lead to the need for a lot more labor-intensive agriculture. And if we think about ecological restoration, someone mentioned wilding, I think it was Will earlier, etc. So a lot of this is at the moment pretty labor-intensive work. Although it's important to recognize what I've called ecological knowledge, or ecologically knowledge-intensive work. Permaculture being an example of the way in which we can use ecological knowledge to reduce the human labor necessary to produce in the agroforestry sector and so forth. But my sense that you're going to have this increased amount of human labor in agriculture means the imperative to be able to produce non-agricultural goods and services with less labor is pretty strong. I do want to say one thing about productivity. Someone mentioned Tim Jackson's work. It's very important. A lot of his critiques of productivity are about speed up. And speed up is not productivity increase. True productivity is taking into account all human inputs relative to an output. So if you have a speed up, that doesn't get you more productivity. It gets you more output because you've had more inputs. And in economics, I mean, this is one of the first things I wrote about, just when I was out of graduate school, is that difference between the measured inputs. So if the firm pays an hour for labor but gets more effort out of the worker, it shows up in the statistics as more productivity, but it's not. It's more input. So I just think productivity is really key to a well-functioning society, and we've got a lot of really serious problems that we have to solve. And to say, no, we're not going to try and have better technology to do it with, I just don't think makes any sense. That said, it's really important that we think about productivity within that same kind of system that we're talking about all these other things. So egalitarian, humane, resilient, secure, all of the values that we have for the kind of economy we're trying, and of course, ecologically sustainable, and actually ecologically restorative. All of the things that we want to build an economy around, that degrowth stands for, that value set, all of that has to be applied to technology and productivity as well. So it's not as if I'm just advocating, oh, let's just let robots run wild or AI run wild or anything like that. It's to say that technology is no different than anything else that we care about, which is that it needs to be democratically controlled and implemented, and we need technology in the service of planet and people, not profits. One last thing I just want to say, because in the chat there was a lot on informal economy, which is we really need to differentiate between people working long hours and not getting income, which is what the informal economy is about, and sort of hours associated with income, which is what the to a large extent, working time debate really is focusing on.
Thank you very much, Juliet. We move on to Nicolina, and I would like you to be brief and ask you one final question, because you mentioned organizing labor in your last statement as the most important thing. Do you have any example on what was the most inspiring example of organizing labor in the last, I don't know, couple of months or year that you would think, well, which could be a leading example?
I don't know if you ask me for Croatia or Europe.
Not necessarily.
Okay, I would like to mention trade unions in the education sector, which actually had a led strike for dignified working position in Croatia, which lasted longer than a month, which didn't happen actually since the Croatian independence, I think, or it happened in the very early 1990s when the railway workers were demanding better wages and also asking for more democratic control in the sector, which was largely clientelistic. So I think that it's remarkable to see that although we have extremely low unionization rate in all sectors, but still private sector is definitely a sector where the position of the unions can be strengthened, we can work on strengthening the position of the unions and unionize more people in the public sector. France is also a good example of especially railway workers who are fighting against Macron's idea to privatize passenger lines. And I think it's also the fact that they didn't privatize it actually has something to do with the fact that France turned its passenger trains to become mobile hospitals now in the corona crisis, so to accommodate basic human needs. Well, yes, gig workers as well. I think that gig workers are very interesting to follow right now, especially workers who are food delivering, who are finding ways to organize, which is definitely far more difficult than when you have some type of representation in the workplace. Yes.
Thank you very much, Nicolina. And we move on to the last question and answer by Anna. And maybe you could reflect in your final statement on what, from your perspective, would be key steps for developing alliances between the degrowth movement or the environmental justice movement and the trade unions, and if you see any progress on this, if you've seen any progress on this in recent years.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sure, I see progress. I mean, we're discussing here all together, and a lot of people are following. Thank you for coming at that point. So I think, yes, we are in the middle. We are in the middle of testing cooperation out of very different perspectives with very different point of views. And that's good and important. We have been working as trade unions for around about a year with a lot of different NGOs from different perspectives. One was the one about environment. And the reason was in order to get new input on a content level. And as far as WIDA is working on now, we want to go the step further. We have a lot of networks that are functioning for years, actually, but they were very, very down to producing content, discussing about words and dots in papers. And the next step that we would like to test actually in that corporations and in that networks is to go the step further. So what we are trying at the moment is to work on a COVID-19 strategy, so that we put topics into public together, because one important thing of power is awareness at the moment in the media-driven society, as at least in the Northern European countries is the case. So how can we how can we make our points in a broader public where a lot of media is not earned by us or is even kind of hostile. So that's the thing we are at the moment working on, using the network works more for strategic questions, more for questions of awareness, and for exchanging resources. There is a lot of content in the networks, and it's not connected with the media networks, for example, or with the communication networks. So there are content people that are creating brilliant content, but they're not connected with the media experts that can reproduce it in a way that media can work with it. So we are working on that at the moment, but it's really hard, to be honest, at the moment, because we are struggling on company level so hard. I mean, the Laudamotion Ryanair conflict makes us work hours just not to lose all the workers as members as well, because they feel we are cheating them, although we try to fight for an income that is above poverty line. So these company-based fights are taking a lot of energy. And I think we have to take into account that if we are working together, that's an energy that no other organization has to put in, right? So what is important at the moment, we think, and I think we agree on that, all of us, that investment in public sector is important now, and that there has to be tremendous spending in the important universal public services, and that there has be a focus on what impact it has, long-term impact it has on nature. And there we need a lot of clear decision-making of the people that are in power at the moment. So one thing, even if it's a sector that is out of a degrowth perspective a bit problematic, let's take the airline industry. We need a clear decision where Austria wants to go with that. And that would make it much easier to find solutions, to find ways to transform the sector. But it's always a wobbering around and not clearly stating where the journey should go. So yeah, that's basically the things that we are working on. And collective bargaining, as there was a question in the chat, what about making the part of the cake bigger and not the cake itself? Yeah, we are going to work on that, but it's going to be a hard struggle because companies are in trouble all over the world, and the labor market is as it is. And that's usually an environment that is hostile for making the share of the cake bigger.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much to all the panelists for the lively discussion. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. I'm sorry that I was not able to keep the time exactly, but Haliki has posted somewhere the link. You could see it in the chat so when you follow the link, you can join the virtual coffee break. So enjoy your coffee or whatever you're gonna have during the break. Thank you very much for joining this session.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank